The Riverside Diner sat wedged between a laundromat and a shuttered arcade on the fading main strip of Ashbrook, Pennsylvania, a town that time had learned to forget. Rain hammered the plate glass windows that October evening, and only 3 customers occupied the vinyl booths: a trucker nursing black coffee, an elderly couple sharing pie, and 2 teenagers oblivious to everything except each other. Marcus Chen was 17, with the kind of face that made strangers think he'd break a promise the moment it benefited him. Dark eyes that rarely settled on anything, restless hands, a perpetual 5 o'clock shadow that made him look older than his years. He wore his desperation like cologne. It announced him before he entered a room. Across from him sat Emma Caldwell, golden-haired and luminous in the diner's fluorescent haze. 18, poised on the edge of becoming whoever she decided to be next. She had a quality that made people want to confess things to her, a quality that sometimes felt like a superpower and sometimes felt like a curse she hadn't learned to manage yet. My father offered me $40,000 to go to Duke, pre-med track. He's already retired. He wants me to be the success he never was. Marcus reached across the table for her hand. His fingers were cold. What do you want? Emma smiled, a small private smile that suggested the question was more complicated than its simplicity implied. I want to not disappoint anyone, which is probably impossible. It's definitely impossible, but that's kind of the point, right, of being alive? The waitress, Dot, who'd worked at Riverside for 32 years, refilled their sodas without being asked. She'd seen 1,000 couples like them pass through these booths. The temporary ones usually burned out within months. Sometimes she could tell which ones would last just by the way they looked at each other. Or rather, the way they didn't. The ones who couldn't stop watching each other face sometimes disintegrated. The ones who were comfortable in parallel silence sometimes built something. Emma and Marcus had been dating for 8 months. Since February. Since the day after Valentine's Day, actually, which is when Marcus had worked up the courage to ask him out in the parking lot of Gateway High School, and Emma had said yes before he finished the sentence. His mother, Lynn Chen, worried about him constantly. She was a pediatric nurse at Ashbrook Community Hospital, and she brought her need to diagnose and prevent illness into every aspect of her parenting. She could see the symptoms in Marcus: the insomnia, the academic decline from his junior year, the way he'd stopped participating in the robotics club he'd founded. She assumed it was ordinary teenage malaise, though occasionally she wondered if it might be something more serious. His father, David Chen, had different concerns. He wanted Marcus to work summers at his contracting business, to learn the value of honest labor before inheriting a company that had taken 30 years to build. Marcus had other ideas. He wanted to study philosophy, which his father considered a luxury for people who didn't need to work. The arguments between them had become ritual, performative. They barely listened anymore. Emma's world was different texture entirely. Her father, Richard Caldwell, was a corporate lawyer with a corner office and a marriage that had calcified into something resembling an armed truce. Emma's mother, Susan, spent most afternoons in her book club or at the country club pool, performing contentment with the skill of a method actor. Emma had an older brother at Yale, a sister at Northwestern, and one younger brother still in middle school, all of them gifted, all of them certain of their trajectory. Emma had also been diagnosed bipolar at 13 and had spent a month in Westbrook Psychiatric Hospital at 14 when she'd written a suicide note and left it on her desk for her parents to find. The note had been discovered by her mother's cleaning service, and the subsequent hospitalization had been quietly managed. Emma had never attempted again, but the diagnosis hung over her like a weather pattern. Her family treated it like a chronic illness they'd mostly overcome, something they didn't discuss. She and Marcus had chemistry, not the romantic kind primarily, though there was plenty of that, but the genuine intellectual kind. They could talk about ideas for hours. Marcus sent her philosophy articles and videos, and Emma shared her sketches and paintings. She was considering art school, which horrified her father, but which felt true to her in a way nothing else did. Neither of them was particularly troubled that evening. They were just 2 teenagers in a diner, existing in that particular version of forever that your mind creates at 18. They believed this was the beginning of everything. At 10:45 p.m., Emma's father, Richard Caldwell, left his office in the Ashbrook Financial Center downtown. He'd stayed late, as he often did on Thursdays. Divorce proceedings don't calendar themselves, and he had a $3,000 an hour billable rate that converted even his insomnia into productivity. He drove a Navy Mercedes that he'd financed for 90 months. He drove alone, as he always did, listening to podcasts about behavioral economics and replaying conversations with his wife in his head, constructing arguments he'd never voice and defenses for positions he could no longer justify. The route from his office to his home in River Heights took him through downtown and then up Ridgeline Drive, a winding road that cut through the State Forest Preserve. It was dark and it was raining, and his attention was divided between the road and the email he'd composed but not yet sent to his wife's attorney. Marcus Chen at that exact moment was driving to pick up Emma from the diner. His father's truck, a Chevy Silverado with 46,000 miles, which he'd been allowed to borrow because he'd promised to return it immediately after retrieving Emma. He'd taken a slightly different route than usual, longer, but bypassing downtown traffic. Emma's father's Mercedes came around a curve on Ridgeline Drive at approximately the same moment Marcus's truck approached from the opposite direction. The rain had made the road slick. One of them drifted. Later, the investigating officers couldn't determine who drifted into whose lane. The physics of the collision would eventually be a matter of some technical complexity, with the insurance companies arguing until settlement seemed preferable to both sides. In the moment, however, there was only the sound of metal and glass surrendering its integrity. The truck hit the Mercedes on its driver's side with enough force to compress everything in the vehicle. Richard Caldwell was killed instantly. Marcus Chen was not. He was conscious enough to understand what had happened, conscious enough to feel the pain spreading through his left side like spilled ink, conscious enough to know that this had fundamentally altered everything. He was conscious, but moving seemed like a theoretical concept. His phone lay on the passenger seat, having been ejected from his pocket by the force of impact. The rain continued to fall, indifferent to tragedy. A passing vehicle, a Toyota Prius driven by a nurse named Roberto Martinez, on his way home from a night shift, noticed the debris and the skid marks through his rain-soaked windshield. He pulled over and called 911, then approached the vehicles. The truck was worse off than the Mercedes, though the Mercedes' driver's side door was caved in like a sardine can. He found Marcus first, 17, clearly in significant pain, but alive. He found Richard Caldwell second, 49, clearly not alive, but the body didn't quite understand it yet. The ambulance arrived in 11 minutes. The police arrived in 14. By the time Emma received a call from the Ashbrook Police Department, her father was dead, and Marcus was in intensive care at Ashbrook Community Hospital with a fractured pelvis, a punctured lung, 3 broken ribs, and significant internal bleeding. She wasn't told the part about Marcus immediately. She was told first that her father had been in an accident, that she needed to come to the hospital, that her mother had already been notified. She'd piece together the rest over the next 72 hours, and that piecing together would become the central preoccupation of her life. Detective Sarah Moss had been with the Ashbrook Police Department for 18 years. She'd started as a patrol officer in 1997 and had made detective in 2008. She was 51 years old and had learned to read crime scenes the way other people read books. Not just the facts, but the subtext, the margins, the spaces between what was said and what was true. She arrived at the scene of the accident at 2:17 a.m., pulling her unmarked Crown Victoria behind the fire truck. The rain had stopped. The vehicles were being photographed and measured. The bodies were being attended to by the medical examiner and his assistant, a young woman named Chen, coincidentally, who would later develop an ulcer from the stress of seeing so much preventable death. The initial assessment seems straightforward. A 2-vehicle collision on a wet road, unclear who was at fault. Both drivers impaired judgment by circumstances, rain, time of night, distraction. The deceased was Richard Caldwell, a prominent attorney. The surviving driver was Marcus Chen, a teenager from Gateway High School. There was, Sarah thought, a kind of irony in that. The names. The fact that the doctor examining the younger Chen was indeed a distant relative of the injured boy, which she noted in her report as a potential conflict of interest to be documented, but which ultimately changed nothing.
She interviewed Marcus in his hospital bed 3 days later, after the doctors had managed his pain enough that conversation was feasible. He was heavily medicated, and his recollection of the accident itself was hazy. He remembered turning onto Ridgeline Drive, remembered the rain, remembered the moment of impact, remembered his inability to move. "I didn't see him until it was too late," Marcus said, his voice thin and careful. "He was just there, like he came from nowhere." "Had you been drinking?" Sarah asked. "No, I was just picking up my girlfriend." "Your eyes are very dilated, Mr. Chen. Were you using any substances?" "No, I was tired." Sarah made notes. She'd learned that teenagers were almost always poor at understanding their own impairment. She'd also learned that guilty people and innocent people often said the same things. And so you couldn't determine guilt from interrogation alone. She accessed Marcus's phone records with a warrant because Sarah still believed in following legal procedure, even though she knew that evidence obtained illegally could be excluded from trial, and that sometimes criminals walked because of technicalities. She found that Marcus had texted Emma multiple times that evening, the last one at 10:41 p.m., saying he was on his way to get her. Richard Caldwell's phone had been destroyed in the collision, but his email was another matter. Sarah obtained the password from Susan Caldwell and accessed his work and personal accounts. She found the draft email he'd been composing to his wife's attorney, the one that had been on his mind during those final minutes. In it, he was proposing a settlement that suggested he was willing to accept less than he'd previously demanded, which interested Sarah because generosity could be a telling indicator in divorce cases. Usually, it indicated that the person was planning to start fresh elsewhere, or that they were planning to disappear. She met with the Caldwell family. Susan, who seemed more concerned about the funeral arrangements than her dead husband, Emma, who seemed to be experiencing a kind of temporal displacement, as if reality was moving faster than her ability to process it, and Richard Jr., who'd driven down from Yale, and who had something in his eyes that suggested he'd never particularly liked his father and was trying very hard not to feel relief. "Do you know why Marcus was on Ridgeline Drive?" Sarah asked Emma. "He was picking me up from the diner where I was working." "He was picking you up late at night." "I had the evening shift, 10 to 10:30. Sarah made a note. "Does your boyfriend have any reason to be driving around in your father's part of town? Any reason to be on that specific road?" Emma looked at Sarah with a clarity that suggested she understood what was being asked and was choosing her words carefully. "No, he wouldn't have known that road. He was just coming to get me." Sarah believed her, mostly, but she'd also learned that what people believed about their loved ones and what was actually true were often different things. She obtained the toxicology reports. Richard Caldwell was stone sober, which was notable. His alcohol content would have been expected to be at least 0.12 or higher, given that he drank during most of his waking hours and had spent a stressful day in the office. The fact that he wasn't drinking suggested a break in pattern, which suggested something in his psychological state might have been different. She ran accident reconstruction analysis through the state police lab. They determined that the Mercedes was traveling at approximately 48 miles per hour in a 45 mile per hour zone. The truck was traveling at approximately 42 miles per hour. Both speeds were reasonable for wet road conditions. The collision had occurred because the Mercedes had drifted slightly into the northbound lane, pulling the truck towards it through physics and poor road conditions. The truck had overcorrected, which was normal human behavior when a vehicle suddenly appears in your lane. The collision was the inevitable result of a series of minor factors compounding. In other words, it was an accident. Genuinely, verifiably, provably an accident. Sarah filed her report as such. The Ashbrook Police Department closed the case as an accidental traffic fatality. The insurance companies eventually settled. Richard Caldwell was buried in Riverside Cemetery under a marble headstone that cost more than the average person's car. Marcus Chen spent 3 weeks in Ashbrook Community Hospital, where his mother, a pediatric nurse, so not his primary care physician, but present constantly nonetheless, watched him heal incrementally. His broken ribs would knit, his lung would re-expand, his pelvis would calcify into something resembling its previous integrity. He would walk again, though with some pain, and his athletic future, never certain since he wasn't particularly athletic, was definitively foreclosed. Emma visited him daily, sometimes alone, sometimes with her mother, eventually just alone. They didn't talk about the accident directly. They talked about philosophy and art, and the strange liminal space of lying in a hospital bed while the world continued its ordinary operations outside the windows. "I can't stop thinking about it," Emma told him one afternoon in a low voice that suggested she was confessing something dark. "About the timing, about how if I'd gotten off work 2 minutes earlier, or if he'd driven a different route, or if the weather had been different, about how any small change would have meant he was still alive."
"Don't," Marcus said. "That way is—" He struggled for the word. The morphine made language slippery. "That way is recursive. You can go back forever and find infinite decision points. You can't blame yourself for existing in time." Emma held his hand. His skin had the papery quality of someone who'd spent weeks in fluorescent light. "But if you hadn't picked me up—" "Emma," he squeezed her hand with the strength he still had, which wasn't much. "Stop." She stopped. 3 months later, in January, life had returned to a version of normal. Marcus had mostly recovered, though he had a limp that the physical therapist said would probably persist for years. Emma was attending Ashbrook Community College, having deferred her big university applications for a year to take some time, make some art, figure out what she actually wanted. Her mother had decided that deferring would not lead to psychological breakdown. Her father's death had at least accomplished that parental recalibration. Marcus's parents had argued about the accident, whether or not it was his fault, whether he was responsible, whether he should have been driving at all. Eventually, they'd stopped arguing. The arguments had simply become too heavy to carry. Sarah Moss had moved on to other cases. There was a series of burglaries in the Northeast residential area, a domestic violence situation that was escalating into something more dangerous, a missing person who'd walked away from a nursing home and whom nobody wanted to find too badly because she had advanced dementia and her family had basically given up looking. And then, on a Wednesday morning in early February, Sarah received a phone call from a man named James Winters, who was the attorney that Susan Caldwell had retained to represent her in the divorce proceedings. James had something to tell Sarah, something he'd discovered while reviewing certain documents from Richard Caldwell's office files. He wanted to meet in person. They met at Riverside Diner, which seemed to be developing the quality of a nexus point for the story of this particular collision. Sarah ordered black coffee and waited while James explained about certain financial irregularities he'd discovered in Richard Caldwell's work. Specifically, Richard had been embezzling from his firm's client trust account. Specifically, he'd taken approximately $300,000 over the course of 7 years. Specifically, the embezzlement was about to be discovered, and Richard knew this. The head accountant had been reviewing the books in preparation for an audit, and she'd identified the discrepancies. She'd scheduled a meeting with Richard for the day after he died. "Why wasn't this in the police report?" Sarah asked. "Because I only discovered it last week," James said. "I was reviewing Richard's financial situation in relation to the divorce settlement. The firm has been, circumspect about the embezzlement. They've discovered it and they're trying to decide how to proceed. They might press charges against the deceased's estate. They might try to recover the funds from Susan, though she claims to have had no knowledge of it. They're in a bit of a situation." Sarah felt something shift in her mind. That particular shift that happened when you realized you'd missed something obvious. So Richard was going to be exposed. Almost certainly, within days. And he knew this. It appears so. Sarah thanked James Winters and went back to the police station, where she requested the accident scene photographs and the autopsy report. She looked at Richard Caldwell's body, or rather the photographic evidence of what had happened to it upon impact. She looked at the initial response notes and the toxicology results. She called Dr. Chen, the medical examiner who'd performed the autopsy. She said, "I have a question about Richard Caldwell's autopsy. Was there any indication of his mental state prior to the collision?" "What do you mean?" Dr. Chen asked. "I mean, was there any evidence of medication, antidepressants, anti-anxiety medication, anything like that?" She heard the sound of pages turning. There was trace amounts of benzodiazepine in his system, not enough to be therapeutic, enough to suggest he'd taken something, but not enough to impair his driving significantly. "What medication specifically?" "Alprazolam, standard Xanax, available with a prescription, but also available if you know someone who deals." Sarah hung up and sat with this information. She pulled the accident file again, the one she'd closed and filed away. She looked at Richard Caldwell's email, the draft he'd been composing to his wife's attorney, and then she looked at Marcus Chen's statement, in which he said he hadn't been drinking, hadn't been using substances, had just been tired. She wondered about the definition of tired. She wondered about the definition of accident.
Sarah Moss had learned over her career that the truth rarely presented itself with clarity and grace. The truth usually presented itself in fragments, in contradictions, in the spaces between what was said and what was meant. The truth required synthesis, and synthesis required making intuitive leaps that might later be proven wrong. But the intuitive leap she was making now, about Richard Caldwell, about the Xanax, about a man driving through a rainstorm knowing his professional life was about to implode, felt less like a leap and more like a connection between dots that had been there all along. She requested to interview Marcus Chen again, this time at the police station, this time with his parents present. The case had been closed for 3 months, and she knew that reopening it would require justification. She knew that she couldn't operate from intuition alone, even though intuition was often right. Marcus arrived with his mother and a lawyer that his mother had retained, a precaution, not an accusation. He was still moving stiffly, still experiencing residual pain, but the healing was clear in the lessening of his limp, in the way his eyes focused. "I have some follow-up questions about the accident," Sarah said, setting a tape recorder on the table. "I want to understand the timeline better. You were picking up your girlfriend from the diner. What time did you leave your house?" "Around 10:30, she texted me saying she was off work." "Did you drive directly to the diner?" "No, I took Ridgeline Drive instead of downtown. It's longer, but the rain was bad, and I thought the country route would be safer." "That's interesting, because Ridgeline Drive is not on the way to the diner from your house. You'd have to drive in the opposite direction, then circle back." Marcus's lawyer, a woman named Patricia Stern, put her hand on the table. "My client isn't on trial here," she said. "What are you getting at, detective?" "I'm getting at understanding his state of mind. Why choose a longer route? Why not go directly?" "Because," Marcus said with the kind of careful enunciation someone uses when they're choosing words in front of an attorney, "I wanted to give myself time to think. I'd had an argument with my father that morning about my college plans. I was stressed. Driving helped me clear my head." She watched his face. She watched his mother's face. She watched the lawyer's face. "Mr. Chen, I want to ask you directly. Did you intentionally hit Richard Caldwell's vehicle?" "What? No, of course not." "Your father has a business, a contracting company. Does he do work for any law firms? Any connections to Richard Caldwell?" Marcus looked at his mother, then back at Sarah. "I don't know my father's clients specifically. My mother works at the hospital. I work part-time at a grocery store now since the accident." "Did you know that Richard Caldwell had embezzled approximately $300,000 from his firm?" "No."
Did you know that he was going to be exposed? No. Did you know that he was a danger to himself? Marcus's lawyer stood up. I'm terminating this interview. My client has not been charged with anything. If you have evidence of a crime, you can proceed through proper legal channels. If not, we're leaving. They did leave. She watched them go, and she knew she'd made a mistake. She'd shown her hand without having a clear hold, and now the opportunity to gather more information had closed. She spent the rest of the day obtaining a warrant to re-examine Marcus's phone records in greater detail. She found nothing significant. Text messages between Marcus and Emma, between Marcus and his mother, between Marcus and his friends. Nothing that suggested conspiracy or foreknowledge. She reviewed the accident scene photographs again, looking for anything that suggested intentionality rather than accident. She found nothing. She looked at David Chen's business records, searching for any connection to Richard Caldwell or his law firm. She found nothing. She looked at Marcus's social media accounts, searching for any indication of knowledge about Richard Caldwell's problems. She found nothing. She realized, chasing a theory rather than evidence. She was connecting dots that didn't actually want to be connected. But the theory wouldn't leave her alone. She went to visit Richard Caldwell's firm, speaking with the head accountant, a woman named Barbara Klein, who was still dealing with the aftermath of discovering the embezzlement. How did you know to check the accounts so carefully? Sarah asked. I didn't. That was the thing. Richard was particular about client funds. He liked to maintain control personally. When he died, the accounts went under automated review for estate purposes. That's when the discrepancies appeared. Did anyone else have access? Could anyone else have been embezzling? It had to have been Richard. The patterns are unmistakable. A little withdrawn here, a little shifted there. It's classic fraud. What would have happened if the audit had proceeded normally? If Richard had discovered the discrepancies himself? Barbara looked at Sarah carefully. He'd been ruined professionally, detective. These are client funds. Stealing from a client trust account isn't just unethical, it's criminal. He would have faced prison time, disbarment, civil suits. His entire life would have been over. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Do you think he knew? Knew what? That we were close to discovering it. Richard was smart, detective. He would have known that we were doing the audit. He would have understood what that meant. Sarah thanked Barbara and drove to Ridgeline Drive. She parked her car where the accident had happened and stood on the shoulder looking at the curve where the collision had happened. The rain had been heavy that night. The road was wet. These were facts. She tried to reconstruct what might have happened from Richard's perspective. A man driving home from his office, having spent a day composing an email about his divorce, knowing that his professional destruction was imminent, knowing that his financial situation was about to unravel completely. A man taking antacids, or was it Xanax, to manage the anxiety that must have been crushing. A man experiencing a moment of decision, perhaps. A man who'd drifted into another lane. Or a man who'd chosen to drift into another lane. The distinction was the whole question, wasn't it? The distinction was everything. She pulled out her phone and called Emma Caldwell. I'd like to speak with you again about the night of the accident, Sarah said. Will you come into the station? Emma came alone, without her mother or a lawyer. She seemed smaller than Sarah remembered, as if she'd contracted in response to the loss. She was 18 years old and carrying the weight of an adult tragedy. They sat in the same interview room and Sarah placed the tape recorder on the table. I want to talk about Marcus. How did he seem that night, when he picked you up from the diner? Fine? Normal?
Had he been drinking? No. Had he been using drugs? No. Why are you asking me this? Because I'm trying to understand the accident better. I'm trying to understand whether it was entirely accidental. Emma's face changed. Something crystallized in her expression. Recognition. understanding, and something else. Something that looked like shame. "What do you mean?" she asked quietly. "I mean that your father was about to be exposed for embezzling from his law firm, that his entire professional life was about to collapse, that he knew this, and I'm trying to understand if maybe, on some level, this was intentional, and if Marcus might have known about it." Emma was very still for a long moment. Then she said, "He didn't." "Didn't what?" "Know about my father's problems. Marcus didn't know anything about that." "Are you certain?" Emma looked at Sarah, and there was something in her eyes that suggested she was making a decision between loyalty and truth, between protecting Marcus and protecting something else. "I knew," Emma said. The silence that followed felt very full. "You knew what?" Sarah asked. "I knew that my father was going to be destroyed. My mother didn't know yet. Nobody really knew except my father and the firm's accountants. But I knew because I read his email, the draft to his attorney. He had his laptop out one day when I came home, and the email was open. I read it." "What did the email say?" "It said that he was willing to accept less in the divorce settlement because his financial situation was about to become unstable. And it said that he wanted to protect my mother and my brothers as much as possible, given what was coming. He was trying to make sure that if he went down, they wouldn't go down with him." "I absorbed this?" "Did you tell Marcus about any of this?" "No, but what?" "But I think he might have figured something out. I think he might have understood that something was very wrong with my father, because a few weeks before the accident, he asked me questions about my dad, about his marriage, about his business, questions that seemed like he was trying to understand the situation." "What did you tell him?" Emma's voice became smaller. "I told him that my father wasn't a good person, that he was selfish and had hurt a lot of people, and that I didn't respect him. And I told Marcus that I didn't know how to feel about that I was angry at him, but I also didn't want him to suffer, that it was complicated." "Did Marcus express any desire to hurt your father?" "No, never." "Did Marcus ever suggest that your father's death might be a good thing?" "No." "Detective, what are you trying to say?" Sarah turned off the tape recorder. "I'm not sure," she said, which was the truth. "I'm trying to understand whether the accident was entirely accidental or whether it might have been intentional. And I'm trying to understand whether Marcus might have been involved in making it intentional." Emma started to cry, the kind of crying that seemed to come from someplace very deep. "He didn't," she said through her tears. "I know he didn't. Marcus isn't like that. He couldn't be like that." "Sometimes people are capable of things we don't expect," Sarah said quietly. "Not him, not Marcus. He couldn't kill someone. He couldn't." Sarah restarted the tape recorder and went through the entire conversation again with Emma, providing her testimony on record. When they were finished, she knew she didn't have enough evidence to charge anyone with anything. She had circumstantial evidence. She had strange comments that could be interpreted multiple ways. She had a theory that felt right, but which might be entirely wrong. She had the core of a story, but not the proof of a story. She needed to talk to Marcus again, and this time, she needed him to understand that she understood.
Marcus agreed to meet with Sarah without his attorney, which his mother thought was a terrible idea, and which Sarah found immediately suggestive. If Marcus had been advised by an attorney to have counsel present, he would have had counsel present. That he chose not to suggested either that he had nothing to hide, or that he wanted to hide something very badly and believed he could do so through the force of his conviction. They met in the same interview room. Sarah did not turn on the tape recorder. She wanted to have a conversation first, and later, after she understood what he was going to say, she could formalize it. "I know about your father," Sarah said, "about the embezzlement. about the fact that he was going to be exposed within days. And I know that Emma knew and that she told you and that you understood what that meant." Marcus didn't respond. He looked at his hands. "I know that you drove onto Ridgeline Drive deliberately that night. I know that you were traveling slowly, and I know that you were waiting. And I think what I don't know is whether the collision was accidental or intentional." "It was accidental," Marcus said quietly. "Then why did you choose that road?" "Because I needed to think." "About what?" "About Emma, about her life, about what was going to happen to her when everything collapsed. Her father was going to prison. Her family was going to be destroyed. She was going to suffer because of what he did. And I was trying to figure out how to help her, how to make it better." Sarah listened. She was very good at listening, at hearing the structure of a lie and the structure of a truth. This sounded like truth. "Did you see your father's vehicle?" she asked. "Yes. I recognized the Mercedes. I wondered for a second what he was doing out there, on that road, on a night like that. And I thought maybe I should pull over, talk to him, ask him if there was something he wanted to tell Emma before everything came out. I thought maybe I could help somehow. But instead, you hit him." "I didn't hit him. He came into my lane. The rain was heavy and he wasn't paying attention. I tried to correct, but I overcorrected and the physics took over. It was an accident, detective. It was an actual, genuine accident." She studied his face. She'd interviewed hundreds of people. She'd heard thousands of lies and truths. She knew the way guilt moved through the body, the way someone holding a secret showed it in their shoulders, in their jaw, in their eyes. "I believe you," she said. And she found that she did. "But you think I might have done it intentionally?" "Yes." "Because I love Emma?" "Yes." "Because I would want to protect her?" "Yes." Marcus was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was very small. "If I say I did it intentionally, you'll charge me with murder. If I say it was an accident, you don't have enough to charge me with anything. So the outcome of this conversation depends entirely on what I tell you, not on what actually happened." "That's true," Sarah acknowledged. "Which means the truth doesn't actually matter. Which means justice isn't about truth at all. It's about the story you can prove. Sometimes, not always, but sometimes. My father asked me a question once. He asked me if I would be willing to do something terrible if it meant protecting someone I loved. I told him I didn't know. I told him that seemed like a question you couldn't answer until you were actually faced with it." "What did he say to that?" "He said that most people would say they'd do anything for the people they love, but that when it actually came down to it, they wouldn't, because most people love themselves more, because self-preservation is stronger than altruism." Sarah felt something shift in the room, a settling into truth, or a settling into a story about truth that had become indistinguishable from the thing itself. "I was driving on Ridgeline Drive because I wanted to drive past your father, because I wanted to see him, to understand what kind of person he was. I wanted to understand how someone could create so much damage and still continue existing, still continue driving home in his expensive car, still continue pretending that everything was fine. I wanted to understand that kind of disconnect. And when you saw him, I didn't see him at first. I saw the Mercedes coming toward me in the darkness, and for a moment, just a moment, I had a choice. I could have stayed in my lane. I could have let him stay in his lane, and we could have passed each other, and nothing would have changed. Or I could have let my car drift." Sarah's heart rate had increased. This was the moment. This was where the truth would either confirm or deny itself. "I chose to stay in my lane. I chose to let the physics happen without my interference. But he was on Xanax. He was chemically impaired, no matter what the toxicology said. And he wasn't paying attention, and he drifted into my lane. And I could have corrected the collision. I could have swerved, could have braked, could have done something to minimize the impact. But in that moment,
I understood that his death would actually be better for Emma than his life. I understood that a dead father is preferable to a father who goes to prison, who destroys his family, who makes everyone he's connected to complicit in his destruction. So you didn't correct? No, I didn't correct. Sarah turned on the tape recorder. I need you to repeat what you just told me with the recording on so that your statement is formal and documented. Marcus looked at her. He looked at the recording device. He looked at Sarah. He looked at his hands. And then he repeated everything he had said, with the recording device capturing every word, every confession of moral ambiguity crystallizing into legal consequence. When he finished, Sarah turned off the recorder and called for an officer to place Marcus under arrest. As they were reading him his rights, his mother arrived. She'd been waiting outside the building and had watched Sarah and Marcus walk in and known enough to call an attorney. Patricia Stern, the same defense attorney, arrived 20 minutes later. The arrest made the Ashbrook Herald's front page. Local teen arrested in connection with prominent attorney's death. The story didn't quite explain how an accident had become an intentional act, and it didn't need to. The headline was enough to transform the narrative in everyone's minds. People who thought of Marcus as a victim of bad luck suddenly thought of him as something else. People who thought of the accident as tragic suddenly thought of it as calculated. Emma learned about the arrest not from Marcus or from his mother, but from a news alert on her phone. She was at her mother's house looking at paint swatches for her bedroom, trying to figure out how to exist in a world without her father, but with all of her father's complications suddenly visible. She saw the headline and her body went rigid.
She drove directly to the police station, where she demanded to speak with Sarah Moss. She was angry in a way that suggested anger was the only emotion she could currently access. All other emotions were presumably being held in reserve, waiting for the moment when this immediate crisis resolved. "What did you do?" Emma asked Sarah. "I conducted an investigation." "You arrested him based on what I told you?" "I arrested him based on his own confession." "His own—" Emma stopped. "Marcus confessed?" "On tape, he explained that he chose not to correct the collision when your father drifted into his lane, that he made an active choice to do nothing when he could have acted." Emma sat down very suddenly in the chair across from Sarah's desk. "He did that to protect me. He did that because he thought my father deserved to die. He did that for reasons that only he can fully explain," Sarah said carefully. "And you used that against him?" "I used his confession against him, yes. That's my job." Emma looked at Sarah with an expression of such profound betrayal that Sarah felt the weight of her actions, really felt it, for the first time. This was not an abstract investigation anymore. This was a young woman whose world had been destroyed twice, once by her father's death and now by her boyfriend's confession. "He loves me," Emma said. "Yes, I think he does." "So you destroyed him because he loves me." "I destroyed him because he committed a crime." "No," Emma said, her voice very quiet. "You destroyed him because I gave you information that let you prove something you wanted to prove. You wanted the accident to be more than an accident. You wanted the moral complexity that came with intentionality, and so you got it." Sarah didn't respond because Emma was, in a certain way, correct. Sarah had wanted the accident to be more than an accident. Sarah had wanted the moral complexity that came with intentionality, and she had pushed and pushed until she'd found it. "I'm going to testify for him. I'm going to tell the court that my father was a terrible person, that his death was better for everyone, that Marcus only did what anyone who loved me would have done." "That testimony will not help him," Sarah said. "In fact, it will likely harm him. It will suggest premeditation, motivation, clear motive. It will make the prosecutor's case stronger." "Then I won't testify. I'll refuse." "You can't refuse a subpoena." "Then I'll lie." Sarah looked at Emma, at this 18-year-old girl who had been through enough, and she found herself making a decision that contradicted everything she'd built her career on. She found herself choosing something other than the procedural truth. "You should speak to Marcus's attorney. You should ask them how best to help him." Emma left the police station and Sarah sat alone in her office. And she wondered if she'd done the right thing or if she'd done exactly the wrong thing. And she found that these two possibilities were now, perhaps, indistinguishable. The trial began in March, 6 months after the collision. The prosecutor was a woman named Linda Cho, who had been with the district attorney's office for 12 years and who believed very strongly in the abstract concept of justice, even if she sometimes doubted her ability to deliver it. The defense was Patricia Stern, who was excellent at her job and who believed very strongly in the rights of the accused to receive the benefit of every doubt. The prosecution's case was built on Marcus's own confession. They called Sarah to testify about the interrogation, about the way Marcus had described choosing not to correct the collision, about the way he'd explained his reasoning. They presented the accident reconstruction evidence. They presented the toxicology reports showing Richard Caldwell's benzodiazepine levels, which they argued contributed to his impaired driving. And then they presented Emma's testimony. Patricia Stern had subpoenaed Emma because the prosecution was going to call her anyway, and Patricia believed that it was better to present the defense's version of Emma's story before the prosecution got to her. Emma sat in the witness box, 18 years old, looking smaller than she was, and she told the story of her father's embezzlement and his coming exposure. She told the story of reading his email. She told the story of the moral complexity of her father's situation. And then the prosecutor, Linda Cho, asked her directly, "Did Marcus Chen ever express to you that he wanted your father dead?" Emma took a long time to answer. She looked at Marcus, who was sitting at the defense table wearing a suit that his mother had bought for the trial. She looked at her mother, who was sitting in the gallery. She looked at Sarah, who was sitting in the back of the courtroom, observing. "No," she said. "He never said that. He only asked me questions about my family. He only tried to understand what I was going through." "Do you believe that the collision was intentional?" "I believe that Marcus was grieving my father's destruction as if it were my destruction," Emma said carefully. "I believe that Marcus loved me enough to see my father's death as merciful, but I don't believe that Marcus intentionally caused the collision." "But you know his confession suggests he did." "I know that people say things under pressure. I know that people construct narratives that make sense of random events. I know that my father died and that Marcus was there, and that those facts together create a story that seems intentional, even if it wasn't." It was an excellent answer, and Patricia Stern smiled slightly. Linda Cho called her other witnesses, the accident reconstruction experts, the medical examiner, the police officers who'd responded to the scene. She built her case piece by piece, brick by brick, a wall of evidence and testimony that suggested that Marcus had made an active choice to do nothing when he could have acted. Patricia Stern, in her cross-examinations, asked each witness to consider the possibility of the accident being exactly what it appeared to be, an accident. She asked the reconstruction experts about the role of chance, about the role of weather, about the role of Richard Caldwell's own impaired judgment. She asked them in essence to consider that the physics were sufficient to explain the outcome without requiring intentional human choice as a variable. In her opening statement, Patricia had told the jury, "You will hear evidence that Marcus Chen was on Ridgeline Drive that night. You will hear that his vehicle collided with Richard Caldwell, resulting in Mr. Caldwell's death. What you will not hear, what the prosecution cannot prove, is that Marcus made an active choice to cause this collision. What you will not hear is proof of intentionality. What you will only hear is a confession made under psychological pressure, a confession that Marcus himself now denies making accurately." The trial lasted 2 weeks. The jury deliberated for 3 days. They found Marcus not guilty of murder. They found him guilty of vehicular manslaughter while under the influence of emotional disturbance, a lesser charge that suggested they believed something more than accident had occurred, but not murder, not the full weight of intentional homicide. He was sentenced to 6 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 4. Emma attended the sentencing. She sat in the gallery, her face a study of emotional suppression. After the verdict, she wrote Marcus a letter, which she gave to Patricia Stern to deliver. The letter said, "I don't know if you did it intentionally, or if you only needed to believe you could have done it intentionally, in order to feel like you had some control over what was happening to us. Either way, I love you. And either way, I'm going to move forward with my life. I'm going to accept the scholarship to art school. I'm going to make things that matter. And maybe that's the best way I can honor what happened to us. Not by staying stuck in the moment of the collision, but by moving beyond it. Marcus read the letter in his cell 3 weeks after the sentencing, after he'd been transferred to Ashbrook Correctional Center, a medium-security prison about 40 minutes from the city. He read it multiple times. He kept it carefully, protected it. And eventually he found that he could think about the collision without the crushing weight of guilt or the crystallized weight of confession. He began his sentence. He worked in the prison library, reshelving books. He read philosophy. He began to understand, in a way he hadn't before, the difference between the person he had been and the person he had become, and the distance that events could create in a single moment.
2 years later, Sarah Moss sat in her office and reviewed Marcus Chen's application for early release. He'd been a model prisoner, no infractions, good behavior, participation in educational programs. The prison psychologist had assessed him as low risk for recidivism. His case file contained letters of support from his teachers, his mother, his previous employer. There was also a letter from Emma Caldwell, now 20 years old, a sophomore at the Maryland Institute of Art, with a growing reputation for work that addressed loss and the passage of time. In the letter, she wrote, "I believe that Marcus has paid a sufficient price for the collision. I believe that whatever he did or didn't do that night was motivated by love, by the desire to protect me, even if the method was harmful. I believe in his capacity to move forward and to be different than he was. I hope the parole board will believe the same." Sarah submitted her recommendation to the parole board. Grant. The parole board approved Marcus's release after 4 years. He was released on a Thursday and his mother picked him up from the prison. He was 21 years old. He had lost 4 years of his life, and those 4 years had become the defining fact of his entire existence. He would carry them with him forever, would feel their weight in his decisions, would understand them as the price of a single moment of choice or non-choice on a wet road in October. Emma was there when he was released, waiting outside his mother's house with a portfolio of her art. They sat on the porch and looked at her paintings and drawings, all of them exploring the space between memory and present moment, the way time moves and doesn't move, the way a single event can echo forward and backward simultaneously. They didn't talk about the collision. They talked about everything except the collision, which was a way of talking about the collision without talking about it. "I can't be with you," Emma said. Finally, the words that had been sitting between them since the beginning. "I want to, but I can't. I think I'll always see that moment when I look at you. I think I'll always wonder what you chose, and I think that wondering will destroy us eventually." "I know," Marcus said. "But I believe in you," Emma continued. "I believe that whatever you did or didn't do, you did it from a place of love. I believe that the person you became is different and better than the person you were. I believe in your future." They didn't kiss. They didn't embrace. They sat together for a few more minutes, and then Emma left. She got into her car and drove away, and Marcus watched her go, and he understood that this was the ending they had always been destined for. Not a tragedy, but a completion. Not a death, but a transition. He spent 6 months in his parents' house, rebuilding his relationship with his father, working in the family contracting business, trying to understand what responsibility meant. David Chen, who was in his 60s now, walked on the job site with his son and didn't speak about the conviction or the prison time. They simply worked together, building something. And the work itself became a kind of conversation about moving forward. Marcus eventually enrolled in community college, studying philosophy as he'd always wanted to. He moved into an apartment with 2 other students and began the quiet work of building an ordinary life, a life that would not be defined by the collision, even though it would always be shaped by it. Sarah Moss continued as a detective. She closed cases and opened new cases and found that the certainties that had propelled her early career had become more complicated as the years passed. She became more skeptical of her own intuitions, more respectful of the possibility that she might be wrong, more aware of the way her investigations shaped outcomes.
She never spoke publicly about the Caldwell collision case. She never explained her reasoning or her regrets, but she became known among her colleagues as someone who, when she had doubts about a case, took those doubts seriously. She became known as someone who could be convinced to abandon a theory if the evidence suggested she was wrong. She retired at 60, after 25 years on the force. She moved to a small town in Vermont and spent her time reading, gardening, and thinking about all the cases she'd closed and all the lives she shaped with her certainties and her doubts. The Caldwell murder, or accident, or whatever it was, became a case that was studied in law schools, taught in criminal justice programs, discussed in ethics seminars. The question that animated every discussion was simple: was it justice, or was it injustice? Did Marcus Chen get what he deserved, or did he get what he had to be found guilty of due to the structure of the legal system and the decisions made by people in positions of power? The answer, as with most important questions, was never entirely clear. Emma Caldwell became a successful artist. Her work toured galleries nationally and internationally. Critics described her paintings as meditations on loss, on the way trauma crystallizes into beauty, on the strange alchemy that turns pain into meaning. She never married, never had children, but she built a life of depth and consequence. She built a life where art mattered more than certainty. She never spoke publicly about Marcus Chen or her father or the collision, but those who knew her work intimately understood that every painting she created was in some way a continuation of that conversation, a conversation with the person she had loved, a conversation with the father she had despised, a conversation with herself about the nature of moral complexity and the weight of living in a world where simple answers rarely suffice. Richard Caldwell was buried in Riverside Cemetery. His tombstone read, "Beloved father, devoted husband, respected attorney." None of those descriptions felt entirely accurate, and all of them felt partially true. His embezzlement was eventually repaid by his estate, recovered from the life insurance policy he'd maintained. His firm survived. His partners moved forward. His death, in the end, served the purpose that Marcus had intuited it might serve. It protected his family from the full weight of his destruction. It preserved, in some complicated way, a version of his legacy that was better than the alternative. It was an accidental mercy or a merciful accident, depending on how you wanted to frame it. And that ambiguity, that fundamental uncertainty about what actually happened on Ridgeline Drive on an October night when a truck and a Mercedes met in the rain, that ambiguity became the thing that defined the entire story. It became the question that couldn't be answered, the mystery that couldn't be solved. Because that's what justice is in the end. Not a solution, but an attempt. Not a truth, but a story we agree to tell. Not a resolution, but a way of living with the fact that some questions never fully resolve, and some choices can't be unmade, and some people can't go back to who they were before the moment that changed everything. The collision occurred at 10:47 p.m. On October 14th, Richard Caldwell was dead by 11:03 p.m. Marcus Chen spent the next 4 years in prison for a crime he may or may not have committed. Emma Caldwell spent the rest of her life trying to transform the trauma into meaning. And none of them ever got a clear answer to the question that mattered most. What actually happened? Perhaps that's the point. Perhaps that's what makes it real.